How much money does the typical retired person bring in each year? It's tough to guess because retirement is often the tale of two extremes, those barely getting by and those retiring early with millions in the bank. But the actual income people need during retirement, it's not as scary as you'd initially think. And we're not talking about all multimillionaire households, as you'll see later in the video. First, the average American household of all ages spends about $80,000 per year according to the BLS. As you might expect, the largest categories of spending are housing, transportation, and food, all of which can add up very quickly in a working household. That's especially true when you're dealing with a mortgage or rent on a larger home, multiple vehicles, and the day-to-day costs of a family schedule that never really slow down. Kids going to school, activities like sports and clubs, parents commuting to work, and the constant flow of groceries and household expenses that come with supporting everyone under one roof. But retired people are operating in a very different situation. Those same categories don't disappear, but they really change shape. There's no daily commute, no work-related transportation costs, and often no need for a large family home anymore. Food expenses may still be meaningful, but they're typically for two people or even one, rather than a full household. And housing itself often changes, either because the mortgage is already paid off or because people downsize into something more manageable. But when you isolate retired households, the picture changes in a noticeable way. On average, they spend about $60,000 per year. That's a clear step down from the roughly $80,000 average seen across all U.S. households. It's also important to understand what that $60,000 figure actually represents. It's measured at the household level, not per individual. So in most cases, it reflects the combined spending of two people, not a single retiree living alone. That distinction matters because it changes how large or small that number actually feels in real life, especially when compared to working households that may be supporting kids, larger homes, and much higher day-to-day expenses. Once you understand what retirees tend to spend, the next question naturally becomes how that spending is actually covered. Because unlike working years, retirement isn't about earning a salary. It's about combining multiple income sources into a level that matches a much lower and more stable spending baseline. And this is where the picture starts to change, because a large portion of that baseline spending is already covered before any savings are even touched. The interesting part is how that number changes when you factor in this next part. People often overlook how far Social Security actually goes on its own. The average benefit is about $2,100 per month, which already sets a baseline many retirees rely on more than they realize. Now, when you look at a household where two people are both receiving roughly the average benefit, that adds up to about $4,200 per month combined, or just over $50,000 per year. And that's before any additional income sources, like savings withdrawals, pensions, or part-time work. That single detail changes the entire way retirement gets framed, because suddenly, the gap between zero income and retirement reality is not as wide as people often assume. Instead of needing to replace a full working salary through savings alone, a large portion is already covered through a predictable monthly base. And that shifts the conversation away from, how do I replace everything I used to earn, towards, how much extra is needed on top of what's already coming in. For many households, that difference is much smaller than expected, and it completely reshapes how much savings people actually need in order to maintain a stable retirement lifestyle. But how does Social Security income change the numbers? It has a much larger impact than most people initially realize because it directly reduces how much investment income you actually need to generate in retirement. A common benchmark in retirement planning is the 4% withdrawal rate. Using that framework, if someone needed to generate $60,000 per year entirely from their own savings, they would need roughly $1.5 million invested to sustainably support that level of income. But that's assuming there's no other income coming in. Once you include Social Security, the equation changes dramatically. If a household is already receiving around $50,000 per year from Social Security combined, the amount that needs to be covered by investments drops to just $10,000 per year. And at a 4% withdrawal rate, that $10,000 per year only requires about $250,000 in invested assets. What this really shows is that retirement planning is less about replacing an entire working income and more about closing a much smaller gap than most people assume. And after considering this, the numbers become a lot more digestible. According to data from Resi Club, about 64% of homeowners aged 65 and older own their home outright, meaning there's no mortgage payment. That single detail has a major impact on monthly expenses, because housing is usually the largest cost for most households during working years. Now, even though homeowners still have expenses like maintenance, repairs, property taxes, and insurance, the absence of a mortgage changes the structure of their budget in a major way. For many people in retirement, the mortgage payment that once took up a large portion of their income simply disappears, which immediately reduces the baseline level of spending needed each month. That shift also changes how flexible a fixed income feels. When housing costs are no longer tied to a loan payment, a much larger share of income can go towards other categories, like healthcare, food, or discretionary spending. And even though other housing-related costs remain, they're generally less consistent and quite a bit lower than the monthly burden of a mortgage during working years. So while retirement doesn't eliminate housing costs entirely, the fact that a majority of older households own their homes outright is one of the main structural reasons overall spending tends to decline in retirement compared to peak working years. And just to be clear, most people aren't covering this level of spending with millions in retirement savings. For a large share of households, the financial picture is much more modest than that, and it looks very different from the idea of vast, easily accessible wealth. To see what it actually looks like, for households in the 65 to 74 age range, median net worth sits at about $410,000, while for those 75 and older, it declines to roughly $335,000. These figures include everything from home equity to retirement accounts, meaning a major portion of that wealth isn't held as cash, but instead tied up in items like housing and short-term investments, not things that fund retirement income. And broadly speaking, about half of that net worth is in retirement accounts, like 401ks, IRAs, and brokerage accounts, with a large share of the remainder often concentrated in home equity rather than liquid savings. And spending does usually go down when a household gets smaller, especially if one spouse passes away, but it doesn't drop in a straight one-to-one way. Some categories adjust pretty noticeably. Food costs come down because you're simply feeding one person instead of two. Utilities might come down a little bit, and everyday discretionary spending often drops because routines and activities change. At the same time, other costs don't really scale with household size. Housing is the clearest example. Rent, property taxes, insurance, and maintenance typically stay about the same, regardless of whether one or two people are living there. Healthcare expenses will drop, and transportation costs probably will too. So overall, spending does decline, and in many cases, it can be a meaningful reduction. But it's not a clean cut in half. It usually lands somewhere in between, where the household is clearly spending less than before, but not nearly as little as a simple 50% reduction might suggest. These numbers also vary significantly depending on location. In higher cost of living states, annual spending tends to be much higher due to more expensive housing and other common expenses. In lower cost areas, the same standard of living can often be maintained for considerably less, which creates wide differences in retirement budgets across the country. So while the average household across all ages spends about $80,000 per year, retired households tend to spend closer to $60,000. On the surface, that looks like a big drop, but the context behind it changes how that number should be interpreted. In retirement, spending patterns shift away from the larger financial demands tied to raising kids, commuting, and maintaining a full working household, and more towards a simpler set of ongoing living expenses. Because of that, $60,000 often stretches further than it might seem when compared to peak working years. Even though it is lower than the overall household average, it can represent a relatively comfortable baseline, with room for travel, eating out, and other fun things. So how does your current or projected retirement spending compare to these numbers?